The evidence is overwhelming. The truth is darker than anyone imagined. For more than 100 years, the fate of the Romanov family.
For nearly a century, one of history's most haunting mysteries lay buried beneath Russian soil. The fate of the Romanovs, Russia's last royal family, was shrouded in speculation, rumor, and unanswered questions. The whole fabric of this story is woven into hundreds and hundreds of years. Then, modern DNA analysis unlocked secrets long thought lost. The DNA can't tell us exactly. And what scientists uncovered shocked the world. This wasn't just the unraveling of a royal disappearance. It was a revelation that rewrote the final chapter of Russia's final dynasty. Bones, letters, and forgotten documents all came together, painting a picture more complex, sinister, and unexpected than anyone could have imagined. To tragedy, there is a kind of romance. And so it would have been appealing. Hidden in plain sight for decades, the truth about the Romanovs would challenge everything historians believed and expose secrets no one ever expected to be revealed. The night that changed history. On a cold July night in 1918, something evil happened in a basement in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, the last king of Russia, stood with his family in a small room. His wife Alexandra was there along with their 4 daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son, Alex, who was heir to the throne. The Russian Revolution had been ongoing for over a year. People were angry at the royal family, and many wanted them gone forever. The Bolsheviks, who were the new leaders, had captured the family and kept them locked up in a house in the city of Yekaterinburg. They called this place the House of Special Purpose, but its real purpose was much darker than anyone imagined. That night, the guards told the family that they needed to move to the basement for their safety. The family believed them, but they had no idea what was about to happen to them. Nicholas carried his sick son, Alex, down the stairs because he couldn't walk well since he was diagnosed with a blood disease called hemophilia. Alexandra followed slowly behind, worried about her son as always. 4 loyal servants came with them. Dr. Eugene Bodkin had been their family doctor for years. Anna Demidova was the queen's maid. Ivan Karatonov was their chef. And Alex Trupp helped take care of the king. These brave people could have run away, but they chose to stay with the family they truly loved. When they got to the basement, the guards told them that they were waiting for trucks to take them somewhere safe, but no trucks were coming. Instead, more guards appeared with guns. The leader read something from a paper, but the family couldn't understand what was happening until it was too late. What happened next was so shocking that people didn't believe it for almost 70 years. The guards opened fire on the entire family and their loyal servants. All 11 souls had passed away. Tragically, here's where the Romanov mystery really begins. Because what happened to their bodies afterward would puzzle scientists for decades. The DNA evidence that finally solved this royal mystery would reveal secrets that nobody expected. The disappearing bodies. After the terrible shooting in the basement, the Bolsheviks faced a big problem. They had 11 bodies on their hands and they needed to make them disappear completely. If people found out what really happened to the royal family, it would result in more war and anger across Russia. And so they devised a plan to hide the bodies forever. The guards loaded all the bodies onto a truck and drove them deep into the forest. Their first idea was to throw the bodies down an old mine shaft called the Four Brothers Mine. They thought nobody would ever find them there. But when they got to the mine, they realized it wasn't deep enough. People could discover the bodies and figure out what happened. Their next plan was to pour acid on the bodies to make them harder to recognize. They then tried to burn them. But burning 11 bodies completely is impossible without the right equipment. The Bolsheviks were getting frustrated and scared. Dawn was coming and they were still in the forest with evidence of their terrible crime. Finally, they decided to split up the bodies. They dug one big grave in the forest and buried 9 people there. But 2 of the bodies, the youngest children, were buried separately in a small grave about 70 m away. The men who buried the bodies swore to keep the location secret. They covered the graves carefully and tried to make the forest look normal again. They returned to town and told everyone that the royal family had been moved to a safe place. For many years, most people believed this lie. But secrets this big don't stay hidden forever. Some of the men who helped bury the bodies couldn't forget what they had done. They drew maps and wrote down clues about where the graves were located. However, they were too scared to tell anyone while the Soviet government was still in power. Speaking out about what really happened to the royal family would put them in fearful danger. The DNA analysis that would eventually solve the Romanov mystery was still many decades away. Scientists hadn't even discovered DNA yet. Tragically, for almost 60 years, the royal family's bodies lay hidden in the Russian forest, waiting for technology to catch up with history. The secret discovery. In the 1970s, while the Soviet Union still controlled Russia, a man named Alexander Adunan worked as a geologist. His job was to study rocks and soil, but he was also very interested in history. He had heard whispers and rumors about what really happened to the Russian royal family. From secret survivors who escaped from the basement to hidden royal heirs related to the Romanovs. Unable to ignore his fascination with the Romanov mystery, Avdon decided to investigate on his own. Avdon spent years researching old documents and maps. He talked quietly to elderly people who remembered stories from 1918. Slowly, he started to piece together the clues about where the bodies could be buried. It was dangerous work. The Soviet government didn't want anyone asking questions about the Russian royal family. Finally, in 1976, Avdon found what he was looking for. Deep in the forest near Yekaterinburg, he discovered a grave with 9 skeletons inside. Although he was confident that these were the remains of the royal family and their servants, he couldn't tell anyone. If the government found out, he could be arrested or worse. Avdonin told only a few close friends about his discovery, including a filmmaker named Gay Ryabov. Together, they kept this secret for 15 years. They would sometimes visit the grave site to make sure it was still hidden and safe. They took photographs and made careful notes, but they had to wait for the right time to reveal the truth. The right time finally came in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became freer. Avdonin and Ryab knew that they could finally tell the world about their discovery without fear. They contacted Russian officials and led them to the forest grave. When scientists officially dug up the grave in 1991, they found exactly what Avdonin had discovered years earlier. There were 9 skeletons based on their ages and sizes. Scientists believe these were Tsar Nicholas, Sina, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and the 4 loyal servants who died with them. But something was missing. The royal family had 5 children, not 3. 2 of the youngest children were missing from the grave. This discovery raised new questions that would need modern DNA analysis to answer. The Romanov mystery was far from over. The DNA detective story begins. When the 9 skeletons were found in 1991, scientists faced a huge challenge. How could they prove that these bones really belonged to the Russian royal family? The bodies had been in the ground for over 70 years. The acid and time had damaged them badly. Traditional ways of identifying people, like looking at teeth or measuring bones, could only tell them so much. But science had a new tool that didn't exist in 1918. DNA testing. DNA is like a secret code inside every person's body that makes them unique, even after many years of being deceased. Scientists can read this code from old bones and teeth. Dr. Peter Gill from England and Dr. Pavel Ivanov from Russia decided to try using DNA analysis to solve the Romanov mystery. This was incredibly difficult work. The DNA in the old bones was broken into tiny pieces. The scientists had to be very careful not to contaminate their samples with modern DNA. Everything had to be perfectly clean. They worked in special laboratories and used new tools that had never been used on anything else before. The first step was to figure out who each skeleton was. Using DNA analysis, they could tell which bones belonged to men and which belonged to women. They could also see which skeletons were related to each other as family members. Slowly, they started to put together the family tree. The most exciting part was comparing the DNA from the bones to the DNA from living relatives of the royal family. Prince Philip, who was married to Queen Elizabeth II of England, was related to Tsarina Alexandra through his mother's family. When scientists compared his DNA to that of one of the female skeletons, they found a perfect match. This skeleton had to be Alexandra. For Tsar Nicholas II, they found living relatives in Russia who shared his family line. However, when they tested his DNA, something very unusual showed up. Tsar's DNA had a unique characteristic called heteroplasm, where two slightly different DNA patterns coexisted in the same person. This was so rare that some scientists didn't believe it was real. To prove that the DNA analysis was correct, Russian officials allowed scientists to test the bones of Nicholas's brother, who had died years before the revolution. Amazingly, his DNA had the exact same rare pattern. This proved that the DNA evidence was real and that they had truly found Tsar Nicholas II. The DNA analysis had identified the royal parents and 3 of their daughters. But the royal mystery was far from over. 2 children were still missing, and their disappearance would lead to even more surprising discoveries. The missing children mystery. After DNA analysis confirmed the identities of Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters, a troubling question remained. Where were the other 2 children? Somewhere in the Russian forest, 2 more bodies were waiting to be discovered. This mystery became even more confusing because experts couldn't agree on which children were missing. Russian scientists looked at the 3 female skeletons in the grave and decided that the missing daughter was Maria. But American scientists who studied the same bones believed that the missing daughter was Anastasia. Both groups were confident that they were right, but they couldn't both be correct. The missing son, Alexei, was easier to identify because he was the only boy among the 5 children. He was also the youngest, and scientists knew from his medical records that he had been very sick with hemophilia, a blood disease that made it hard for his blood to clot when he was hurt. This meant he was often weak and couldn't walk long distances. For years after the 1991 discovery, treasure hunters, amateur archaeologists, and curious individuals searched the Yekaterinburg forest for the second grave. They used metal detectors, dug small holes, and carefully studied old maps and documents. Some people spent their entire life savings trying to find the missing Romanov children. The search was made harder because the forest had changed a lot since 1918. New trees had grown, old paths had disappeared, and the area had been built up with new roads and buildings. Finding 2 bodies and thousands of acres of forest seemed impossible, but some people never gave up hope. Peter Sarandinaki, who led a group called the CIRCH Foundation, spent years organizing expeditions to look for the missing Romanov children. He believed that advanced DNA analysis would eventually solve the Romanov mystery entirely. But first, someone had to find those last 2 bodies. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. Instead of professional archaeologists or treasure hunters, it was 3 amateur historians who made the discovery. They had been studying old documents and maps for years, and they had a theory about where the second grave was located. In the summer of 2007, these 3 Russian men went into the forest with simple tools, shovels, brushes, and hope. They started digging about 70 m away from the main grave site. And after hours of careful work, they finally found what they and countless others had been looking for years. Something that would finally allow DNA evidence to solve the royal mystery once and for all. The stunning 2007 discovery. On a warm summer day in 2007, 3 amateur Russian archaeologists made a discovery that would change everything. Sergei Plotnikov, Alexander Oldonan, the same man who found the first grave in the 1970s, and Galina Geranova had been carefully studying old documents and maps, and their theory about where the missing Romanov children were buried turned out to be true. What they found was much smaller than the main grave, just 44 bone fragments and teeth scattered in the soil. The pieces were tiny and broken, much more damaged than the bones in the first grave. This made sense because historical records showed that the Bolsheviks had tried harder to destroy these 2 bodies first using more acid and fire. When Dr. Sergei Pogorel, an official archaeologist, examined the site, he confirmed that the fragments belonged to at least 2 people. One appeared to be a teenage girl about 15 to 19 years old. The other seemed to be a younger person, possibly a boy around 12 to 15 years old. The ages matched perfectly with the 2 missing Romanov children. Even more exciting, the archaeologists found 3 silver dental fillings among the teeth. In 1918, only very wealthy people could afford such expensive dental work. This was strong evidence that at least one of these people had been from a royal or noble family. The Russian government immediately took control of the discovery. They knew that DNA analysis would be needed to prove whether these fragments really belonged to the missing Romanov children. But they also knew this testing would be much more difficult than the 1991 analysis because the remains were so badly damaged. The fragments were so small and broken that traditional identification methods were useless. Scientists couldn't measure the bones or study the facial features like they had with the first grave. Everything would depend on DNA analysis. That's their son. Exactly. And they had one son, and that's Alexei. News of the discovery spread around the world. History experts, royal family enthusiasts, and scientists all waited eagerly to see if DNA analysis could finally solve the complete Romanov mystery. After nearly 90 years, the world would finally know for certain what happened to all 7 members of Russia's last royal family. But as the DNA testing began, scientists discovered something that nobody had expected. The DNA analysis breakthrough. When the 44 bone fragments from the second grave arrived at laboratories in America and Austria, scientists knew that they were facing their biggest challenge yet. The Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Maryland and the Institute for Legal Medicine in Austria would work together to analyze these tiny damaged pieces. Dr. Michael Koppel, who led the American team, said it was like trying to read a book that had been torn into tiny pieces, burned, and then buried for decades. The scientists had to use the most advanced DNA analysis techniques available. The first step was to extract whatever DNA remained in the bone fragments. This required grinding the bones into powder and using special chemicals to pull out the DNA. Even then, they could only get very small amounts of genetic material to work with. For the next step, the scientists used a technique called PCR amplification to make millions of copies of the tiny DNA fragments. This allowed them to have enough material to analyze. They focused on 2 types of DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mothers to their children, and nuclear DNA, which comes from both parents. The mitochondrial DNA testing came first. When the results appeared on their computer screens, the scientists could hardly believe what they were seeing. The DNA from both sets of remains matched perfectly with the DNA patterns they had expected from the missing Romanov children. But the most incredible moment came when they compared the nuclear DNA from the fragments to the DNA from the 1991 grave. The computer showed clear family relations between the 2 graves. It was beyond any doubt that the fragments belonged to the 2 missing children of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. DNA analysis had finally solved the Romanov mystery. The scientists conducted the tests repeatedly using various techniques in different laboratories. Every single test gave them the same result. All 7 Roman family members had been found. However, there was still one more surprise waiting in the DNA evidence. Something that would change how scientists thought about this royal mystery forever. The shocking truth revealed. As scientists continued analyzing the DNA evidence from both Romanov grave sites, they made discoveries that shocked even the most experienced researchers. The DNA analysis didn't just solve the mystery of where the missing children were buried. It revealed secrets about the case that nobody had expected. Firstly, the DNA evidence definitively answered the question that had puzzled experts for years. Which daughter was missing from the main grave? By comparing the DNA from all the remains, scientists could finally prove that the missing daughter was Maria. The 3 daughters in the main grave were Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. Secondly, scientists were shocked when they realized how well preserved the DNA actually was, despite decades of doubt from some researchers. In the early 2000s, a few scientists had claimed that the original 1991 DNA testing was wrong. They said that the DNA was too damaged to trust, and numerous academics published papers trying to discredit the work of Dr. Gill and Dr. Ivanov. The 2007 discovery provided scientists with an opportunity to retest everything using newer, more advanced techniques. What they found was remarkable. The original DNA analysis from the 1990s had been entirely correct. Scientists were able to create complete DNA profiles for all the people who died that night in 1918. They could see the family relationships clearly. Nicholas and Alexandra as parents, their 5 children, and the 4 loyal servants who died with them. The DNA evidence painted a complete picture of what really happened in that basement. Shockingly, the harsh Russian climate had actually helped preserve the DNA. The ground around Yekaterinburg freezes solid from September to April every year. This natural refrigeration had kept the remains in better condition than scientists initially thought possible. The DNA analysis also revealed details about the Romanov family's ancestry that historians hadn't known before. They could trace family lines back through generations and confirm relationships that had only been guessed at from historical records. When all the testing was finally complete, scientists had what they called virtually irrefutable evidence that both graves contained the complete Romanov family and their loyal servants. The ancient mystery that had puzzled the world for nearly 90 years was finally solved through DNA evidence. And the impact of this discovery would reach far beyond solving a historical mystery. The mystery finally solved. All 7 members of Russia's last royal family had been found and identified through DNA analysis. Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alex, were all accounted for along with their 4 faithful servants. The royal mystery that had spawned countless books, movies, and conspiracy theories was finally solved. The DNA evidence did more than just identify the bodies. It told the complete story of what happened on that terrible night in July 1918. The scientific proof showed that none of the Romanov children had escaped despite decades of claims by people who said that there were surviving family members. The DNA analysis proved that these claims were false. The discovery also had important effects on Russian society. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church declared the Roman family to be saints because they had suffered and died for their faith. The complete identification of all family members through DNA evidence supported this decision and brought closure to millions of Russian people. For scientists, the Romanov case became a landmark example of how DNA analysis could solve historical mysteries. The techniques developed during this investigation helped improve DNA testing for other unknown remains around the world. Museums and archaeology departments began using similar methods to identify historical figures and solve old mysteries. The case also showed how important it is to preserve evidence carefully. If the Russian scientists hadn't saved bone samples from the 1991 discovery, it would have been much harder to prove that the 2007 remains belong to the same family. Their careful work allowed future DNA evidence to solve the mystery completely. Today, all 11 people who died in that basement in Yekaterinburg have been buried with honor in St. Petersburg, Russia's old capital city. The DNA analysis that finally solved the Romanov mystery brought peace to their remains and answers to the world. The story of the Romanov family shows how modern science can unlock mysteries from the past that once seemed impossible to solve.